The Chernobyl nuclear plant explosion is considered one of the worst engineering disasters in human history. But did you know that the explosion and the subsequent mismanagement of this crisis also played a part in the dissolution of the USSR? How could this singular, albeit terrible, tragedy lead to the collapse of one of the world's top superpowers? Welcome to Historian's Corner, where today we're going to discuss how the Chernobyl explosion played a part in the fall of the USSR. About 80 miles north of Kiev, just between the border of Ukraine and Belarus, engineers found a woodland area with a low population density, a perfect place to construct a nuclear power plant. The Soviet Union was moving more towards nuclear power due to the distribution of its population, where the majority of civilians resided farther away from the main supply of energy sources in the eastern part of the region. The Soviets also knew that nuclear energy was less damaging to the environment than conventional power sources. This woodland area to be used for the proposed power plant was about 9 miles northwest of the town of Chernobyl, with a population of 12,500. However, with the development of the Chernobyl power plant, the town of Uppbeat sprung up just over 1.5 miles away with a population of 49,000 as employees for the plant and their families moved into the area. The nuclear plant was slated to have 6 nuclear reactors. The first 2 RBMK 1000 reactors were built between 1970 through 1977. Units 3 and 4 were completed in 1983, and 2 more units were in construction at the time of the fateful accident. RBMK 1000 reactors were a Soviet-designed graphite-moderated pressure tube, which used 2% uranium-235 uranium dioxide fuel. Uranium-235 is a uranium isotope that can sustain nuclear chain reactions. These reactors use steam to power 2 500-megawatt turbines. The water pumped into the bottom of the fuel channels that boiled as it was pushed up the vertical pressure tubes to create the steam also acted as a coolant for the zirconium alloy-clad uranium dioxide fuel. In the design, there were 4 main cooling pumps, with one always being on standby. The reactors were also equipped with various safety measures, such as an emergency core cooling system and a minimal insertion of 30 control rods to absorb neutrons and reduce fission rate. However, one of the most important things to know about the RBMK 1000 reactors was that it possessed a so-called positive void coefficient. This meant that if the power increased, or the flow of water decreased, steam production would increase, so that the neutrons that would have been absorbed by the water now increased fission in the fuel. When the power increased, that meant the temperature of the fuel also increased, which reduced the neutron flux. The consequences of these 2 opposing forces vary depending on the power level. When the power level is high, as it was during normal operations, the temperature effects win out, and the excessive overheating of the fuel does not occur. But when the power output is less than 20% of the maximum, the effects of the positive void coefficient win out, and the reactor becomes unstable and prone to sudden power surges. This was an integral part in the development of the meltdown. On April 25, 1986, the Unit 4 reactor was down for maintenance. It was determined that at this time, nuclear engineers would take advantage of the reactor being down to perform a key safety test. The test was scheduled to be performed by the day shift, who'd been briefed in advance on how to perform the testing procedures. The test was delayed due to another plant going down. Unable to begin until the early hours of April 26th, the uninformed and unprepared night shift had to perform the test. Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov, sleep-deprived and ill-tempered, oversaw the procedure. Dyatlov was known for being arrogant, and often cursed at his subordinates for what he perceived as ignorance. Leonid Toptanov, the senior reactor control engineer, took charge of the reactor on the 5th shift just after midnight, and realized he'd made a mistake shortly after. Toptanov had never been in control of the reactor through the shutdown process, and was unaware of the design flaws that made accidents likely. He was well trained, having graduated from the Soviets' version of MIT, the Moscow Engineering and Physics Institute. He knew he'd made a mistake, and that safety protocols indicated he should stop. But Dyatlov insisted on continuing on with the test. Not just one error, but a series of critical mistakes were made that on their own would not have caused such a crucial disaster, but fell together in a deadly domino effect. The plan called for the emergency core cooling system to be shut off. The reactor was operating at about 50% less than maximum power. For the test, the reactor should have been operating at 1,000 megawatts of thermal power, or MWT, but, due to the reduced power, was operating at 30 MWT. Operators tried to raise the power by turning off automatic regulators and reducing the number of control rods. Remember that a minimum of 30 control rods were necessary to operate the reactor, but during this test, operators only used 6 to 8. There was an increase in the flow of coolant and a consequent drop in steam pressure. If the automatic regulators had still been active, it would have shut down the reactor when the steam pressure had been too low. But those had been shut off. To maintain power, operators had to remove nearly all of the remaining control rods, and the reactor became incredibly unstable. Operators reduced the flow of feed water in an attempt to maintain steam pressure, and the pumps that were powered by the slowing turbines were providing less cooling water to the reactor. All of these factors resulted in a power surge that was estimated to be 100 times the normal power output. The power surge resulted in a sudden increase of heat production, which ruptured part of the fuel. Small, incredibly hot fuel particles then reacted with the water, and at 1:23 a.m. caused a steam explosion that destroyed the reactor core. A second explosion occurred 2 to 3 seconds later, and while it's uncertain what caused the explosion, it's hypothesized that hydrogen might have played a role. These explosions sent fuel, core components, structural items, and highly radioactive debris skyrocketing. The plume of smoke and wreckage from the reactor rose over half a mile in the air. Fires broke out in what remained of the building that had housed the Unit 4 reactor, which added to the smoke, steam, and dust. Additional fires started in the adjacent building that housed diesel fuel and inflammable materials. Originally, 14 firemen arrived on the scene at 1:28 a.m., with reinforcements pulling in about 4 a.m. Over 100 firefighters were called in, and this group received the highest radiation exposure. While some of the original fires had been put out by 5 a.m., the graphite fire had started and was responsible for the dispersion of radionuclides and fission fragments high into the atmosphere. Emissions continued for 20 days after the explosion, although they were much lower after the 10th day when the graphite fire had been finally put out. By the end, 50 million curies of radiation had been exposed into the atmosphere, which is the equivalent of 500 Hiroshima bombs. While the USSR hadn't seen a nuclear disaster of this magnitude, they'd covered up separate mistakes at this plant prior. In 1982, there were radiation leaks that were covered up, quote, to prevent panic and provocation rumors, end quote. In 1983, Moscow leaders received reports that the Chernobyl plant was one of the most dangerous plants in the USSR due to lack of safety measures. There were also separate emergencies at the plant in 1984 that had been covered up, according to documents released by Ukrainian authorities on the 35th anniversary of the 1986 explosion. General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, received the call informing him of the reactor explosion around 5 a.m. on April 26th. Gorbachev later stated that, quote, "In the first hours, and even the first day after the accident, there was no understanding that the reactor had exploded and that there had been a huge nuclear emission into the atmosphere," end quote. At the time of receiving the call, he saw no need to wake up other members of the Soviet leadership or call an emergency session of the Politburo. A state commission to investigate the cause of the explosion and deal with the consequences was created instead. Boris Sherbina was tapped to act as chairman of the government's Chernobyl Commission. He arrived on site around 8 p.m. on April 26 to find that very little had been done by local leaders to take responsibility for the disaster. They needed to figure out how to put out the graphite fire, since using water could make the blaze worse. It was determined to use sand, and Sherbina called in military helicopters and chemical units. Citizens of Pripyat still had not been evacuated from the city. The Soviet Union had adopted regulations in 1963 that stated that evacuation of civilians was not necessary unless the radiation dose accumulated by individuals reached a Röntgen level of 75. Radiation levels were increasing in the city from 40 to 300 to 320 microrontgen per second, or 1.2 Röntgen per hour. Armen Abadjian, director of one of Moscow's nuclear power research institutes and member of the government commission, demanded that Chernobyl evacuate the city. But because calculations were showing that the intake of Röntgens was about 4.5 a day, the commission's senior medical officer Yevgeny Vorobyev was reluctant to take responsibility for ordering an evacuation. Although media exposure was prohibited, people started to leave the city as rumors started to circulate about what had happened at the plant. Engineers and workers were not allowed to share news of what had happened. Citizens noticed police officers and soldiers wearing gas masks while they were provided with nothing and were going about their day as usual. Children were sent home from school with instructions to take an iodine tablet and stay indoors. By midnight on April 26, Abzhin and other scientists had convinced Chernobyl to call his boss, Premier Nikolai Rashkov, to approve the evacuation of the city of Pripyat. The entire city was evacuated in 2.5 hours the next day, with the exception of 5,000 workers at the nuclear plant to ensure the shutdown of the reactors, and elderly who didn't understand why they had to leave when they'd been told they could return in 3 days. Evacuees carried radiation exposure to their temporary homes and their bodies, on their clothes and personal belongings. KGB officials were busy trying to squash the spread of, quote, panicky rumors and unreliable information, end quote. But of the 1,000 people who had moved to nearby towns and villages following the accident, 26 had been admitted to the hospital the very next day with symptoms of radiation sickness. The buses that had helped transport the evacuees were sent back to their regular bus routes in Kiev, spreading high levels of radiation across the city of 2 million people. Central Party leadership refused to cancel the massive May Day parade in Kiev, despite increasing levels of radiation. Hundreds of thousands of school-age children were evacuated after that, but, unlike those of Pripyat, were allowed to return in the fall. The USSR would not report to the world about the incident until April 28th, and only because Swedish leaders demanded an explanation for registering unusually high levels of radiation near their plant in Stockholm. In the state broadcast, they were quick to follow the 15-second statement about Chernobyl with information detailing nuclear incidents in other Western countries, such as the 3 Mile Island accident in the US. The explosion at Chernobyl and the subsequent media cover-up was the catalyst for the opening up of the USSR media. Gorbachev had introduced the policy of glasnost, the practice of a more open, consultative government and wider dissemination of information in 1985. But this had been the first major test of policy. It failed spectacularly. The global ramifications of trying to cover up a nuclear disaster further strained already tense relationships with Western countries. Soviet propaganda was battling foreign media instead of providing information to their citizens. Even Gorbachev seemed to be frustrated by the initial lack of information, as seen in a transcript of an emergency Politburo meeting. Gorbachev believed that to restore the Soviet system, the channels of information had to be opened up. Vitaly Koretich, who had strongly condemned the media cover-up, was appointed as the editor of Ogunnik, a weekly illustrated circulation that produced 1.5 million copies. Moscow News was revamped and reported on Gorbachev's restructuring program. Other publications soon followed suit, and this opening up of Soviet media played a critical part in the dissolution of the USSR within the next 5 years, as it took away the government's ability to hide behind lies. Once the glass had been cracked, the downfall of the regime was imminent. Without the mismanagement of the Chernobyl nuclear explosion, do you think the USSR would still be around today? Let us know in the comments. For more historical content, subscribe to our channel and check out some more of our videos. Until next time, thanks for watching Historian's Corner.